truck driving is a hard job in 2019.
Right.
I mean, it's something that the people that do it largely choose to do it because they feel pride. They know that what they're doing is essential. They know that whether you acknowledge it or not, that without them, there wouldn't have been, groceries in the grocery store. And so I hope that the service that they provide and the pride that they take in their job somehow resonates and that people are able to hold on to that beyond coronavirus.
Hey, it's Nate DiSarro, and welcome to Titans of Industry, the podcast where I talk to industry leaders and innovators who are at the top of their game and leading the pack in their fields, uncovering some of the best stories in today's business landscape. In this episode, I sit down with Shannon Newton, the president of the Arkansas Trucking Association, which represents over 300 members ranging from independent owner-operators to international companies like Fedex and JB Hunt. I talked to Shannon about the importance of the trucking industry amid the COVID-19 crisis, how great leaders continue leading through hard times, and how her woman-led team is breaking down barriers left and right. And now let's get to the episode. But before we do, it's important to know that whether you're a small business owner or the face of a multi-billion-dollar industry, your organization has a great story to tell, and Content Titan wants to help you tell it. We are a digital content creation powerhouse built for the 21st century, providing all-in creative, strategic, production, post-production, and distribution services for a 360-degree, 24/7 world. In our world, Titans are passionate, creative doers. They have the experience to take your project from start to finish, minimizing your involvement so you can focus on what matters most, running your business. So if you're ready to take your content strategy and production to the next level, our Titans are ready to help. Now here's my conversation with Shannon Newton. Well, Shannon, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Let's jump right in and just tell me, how did you end up in the trucking world?
Oh, thanks for having me, Nate. My journey to be in trucking was purely an accident. I went to college at the University of Central Arkansas, and I went knowing that I wanted a degree in accounting, went all the way through, graduated with an accounting degree, and the opportunity that presented itself just happened to be with a trucking company in North Little Rock. So my first job was at Maverick Transportation, North Little Rock, and at that time it was really just I saw a lot of value and opportunity within the company, and I didn't really know that much about trucking, and so I kind of came in with a fresh perspective and no preconceived notions, and haven't looked back since then.
So you essentially have been in it your whole career. I won't say you don't know anything else because you know a lot about a lot of things, but talk us a little bit through where it was when you kind of got into it, and then where it is now.
Sure.
I'm sure there's been magnificent changes.
Yeah, well, kind of like I said, when as a 23-year-old going into my first job, I don't know that I had a lot of appreciation for where trucking was, quote unquote. I knew that it was an industry that was prevalent within the state. I thought that there would be a lot of opportunities for growth there within the industry, and so. Looking back, knowing what I know now, looking back at the early 2000s and where the industry was, trucking as we know it was really kind of born in 1980 with deregulation and the mass entrance into the industry and just super growth in the early 80s. And so when I came into the industry, it was only like 20 years old. And so thinking, obviously I didn't know that at the time, but if you roll that forward to now being, 18 years later, the industry is very different. At that time, you still had a lot of people kind of doing it their own way. There was not a lot of sophistication in the enterprise of the trucking industry. You had, people just buying equipment and hauling loads and trying to make money. The data revolution that's happened in the last 18 years with just how much sophistication has come into ROI and pricing and the details of the equipment and MPG and aerodynamics and just so much sophistication today compared to where we were 20 years ago.
So you've moved into a role that you don't directly affect one single company. Talk a little bit about kind of what you do, where you're at now, and what that role looks like day to day.
Yeah, so I worked in the industry, quote unquote, in trucking for a year. So I was at Maverick for a little over a year, and then I came to the association, and kind of my concept of the association at that time, Maverick was involved in the association, so I knew that there was this organization that was involved in advocating for the interest of the industry, but I really didn't know what that meant. And so now, having been at the association, it'll be 17 years next month.
Feels like just yesterday, right?
It is one of those things that seems odd, but I will say that time does fly when you're having fun, and I don't regret a minute of it, and I love being here. But the association represents the industry as a whole. So we have over 300 members, and they span from, individual operators who are in, South Arkansas and run 7 trucks, all the way up to, international enterprises like JB Hunt and Fedex. And so we have a wide fragmented industry and members all over the spectrum in the trucking space, but then also the service providers to the industry. So our membership also includes those who provide insurance or trucks or service or all sorts of technology and safety equipment. So the membership is vast, and in Arkansas that because of the carriers that are located here, because of the impact that the industry has on the economy here, representing them and working in the industry is certainly something that I take pride in, and it makes it more fun than perhaps representing trucking in some other part of the country or representing some other industry in Arkansas. I think the alignment of the industry and the industry here certainly gives our organization a louder voice and a big platform to make an impact.
I think a lot of people, when they think of the trucking industry, they think the annoying big rigs on the highway that won't let them pass or whatever, or almost run them off the road. Talk about the importance of the industry as a whole, especially, and we can, jump into this next, but right now.
So really, if you boil it down to the purpose of the association is to promote, protect, and serve the trucking industry. And so the very core reason that we exist is to help people understand the relationship between the standard of living that they enjoy and the service that the industry provides. And that it's not just the truck that's in front of you between here and Memphis, or the truck that didn't negotiate the intersection the way that you thought that it should. It's actually your medicine or your milk or your couch or the package that you would like delivered to your porch tomorrow that is, quote unquote, in the way. So we're constantly, and always, even pre-COVID, constantly trying to reinforce that connection to people and help them understand the essentiality of the industry and the hard work that the men and women in the industry do to make their lives more enjoyable. And then as you alluded to, certainly over the last 3 months, what we have been harping on for years has been under a big spotlight for the rest of the country to see.
So there's obviously no beating around the bush about it. COVID-19 has caused such a dynamic shift in so many industries, but trucking has to continue. And that's been one of the number one conversations is, how do we get groceries to the grocery store? How do we make sure people can still have the essential needs? So where does trucking fall in the essential category, and how is that, what challenges have you seen throughout this time?
Yeah, so like I said, we've always kind of marketed ourselves as being essential, and then that term kind of became in vogue, and now everyone's talking about what's essential, and non-essential became this differentiating factor before everyone. So we would say, when the world stopped, trucking had to continue. So as you and I, perhaps withdrew and decided to stay home, or particular employers or industries began to shut down and minimize interaction, you still needed water, you still needed gas, you still expected there to be, medicine at the pharmacy, and then even to roll that into some more high impact, the masks and the ventilators and the hospital supplies, those are all delivered by a truck as well. So definitely, as a community, as a state, as a nation, we relied on trucking and expected them to continue to deliver, and that was not without challenge.
So talk through what's been the biggest thing you've seen from your role, and how have you kind of had to lead through that and communicate some of those challenges?
I think the biggest challenge that we as an industry saw or are dealing with in the COVID-19 crisis is uncertainty. And I don't mean that to be like a cop-out answer, but in anything, if you don't know what the result is going to be, if you don't know what the rules are, then that creates a degree of angst. And so initially, the uncertainty of just how are we going to be able to operate, the operational challenges of keeping rest areas open, keeping truck stops open. What were the rules for how can a truck driver use the bathroom? How do they renew their driver's license when DMVs are shutting down? How do they maintain their, medical cards if we're discouraging going into, medical settings? And so all of those operational challenges, initially, that was the biggest hurdle to overcome, because initially trucking continued to run. During mid-March, whenever the initial stay-at-home orders or, states began to make decisions to encourage people to stay at home, our industry was not affected by that in the first stages. You continued to see delivery of essential consumer goods, groceries, and if not only did we continue to deliver, there was a surge in demand. And so we had more trucks on the road, increased demand for products, and then how do you do that in this environment where, I'm driving from state to state to state, and I don't know what the rules are from state to state. So that was the big initial challenge. And then you roll that forward about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it became the economic challenge. Sure. So we met that surge demand. We, applied all the resources that we had to try to make sure that the supply chain was protected and that people had the goods that they expected, and the toilet paper was in the grocery store, and kind of all those things. But then when you started to see the auto manufacturers close and major retail outlets close, and then institutions like colleges and you don't think about all the food service that goes into those types of entities. And so when those major segments of our industry, they're large carriers that dedicate themselves almost exclusively to those types of services, when those disappear, you had this excess capacity in the market. So while groceries continued to be delivered, now you had everyone that used to be hauling car parts, or used to be hauling, clothing, or used to be hauling, dry goods to cafeterias and colleges. Now all of that capacity, went into whatever is still moving, which drove the rates down substantially for everyone. So really no one was protected. Even if you were in those protected sectors, the competition that came at you really created an economic impact, if not crisis, for our industry. Now, certainly, I've had this talk with some of our members. They feel like it's an economic crisis for them. When things are down 14, 15, 20% year over year, that feels really uncomfortable. But if you overlay that with, let's look at the hospitality sector, or if you happen to own a hotel or a restaurant, those industries. So I have to kind of right. I have to kind of remind them, I know that our industry is not performing at the capacity that you want it to, and that your numbers look, unfavorable year over year. But compared to some other industries, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an important parallel, because I remember seeing a video that the CEO of Marriott put out to all of its people, and essentially talked about how devastating this was to the organization as a whole. And I think they were down within 2 weeks, 80% of revenue. And you think about that, how many companies can survive that? And so I know your members, like you said, span from everybody from the independent owner operator to FedEx and JB Hunt and these massive international carriers. And even in that light, there's been a huge shift in, because, we've all heard Amazon and Walmart and all these big box and massive e-com sites surged, and there was a huge demand, and still is. And everybody wants their goods. They don't want to have to go out and get them. But that still affects the trucking industry in a different way, right?
Right. The supply chain looks different. I think, we were already, as an industry, we were already trending towards more, individual delivery, more at home, more e-commerce, smaller packages, fewer miles, distribution centers all over the country. That had already been a pretty significant trend in the industry over the last, 3 or 4 years. But I think the COVID-19 crisis certainly accelerated that, and I think perhaps we will see some lasting impacts from consumer expectations on what that final mile delivery looks like. And so as an industry, we'll have to continue to adapt to that. And, how do you make money, and what type of equipment and what type of drivers are necessary when the routes become smaller and the delivery circle, or just, everything is more compact.
You mentioned the industry really got started in the 80s when deregulation happened, and then here we are, an industry that still has a significant amount of regulation to it, and it's being shaken up just like everything else, but the importance of it is not going away, it's increasing. Do you see additional regulations, different regulations? Do you see anything like that happening? Is that a state thing? Is that a federal thing?
Yeah, so it's funny, we say we're the most regulated, deregulated industry in the country. So there's been a lot of activity, scrutiny forced upon the industry during this crisis. Like I mentioned, if you start shutting down DMVs, you shut down, access to local, health clinics for DOT physicals. So things like hours of service, things like, CDL renewals, medical card renewals, hazmat certifications, all that stuff has kind of been shelved for the last 90 days. It's been remarkable the number of federal regulations that have been either modified or extended or given some sort of grace to allow the industry to continue to operate. Certainly you'd be in a world of hurt if you were, in early March, if your driver's license was set to expire in late April, you would have had no foresight to think, well, I need to renew my driver's license or my medical card 45 days early. But then when the time came, those services weren't available. So a lot of that stuff has been relaxed. I anticipate that most of that stuff will come back online. I mean, of course, we're going to go back to renewing our driver's license and medical cards on certain time frames. Kind of unplanned, there was actually a change in the hours of service rulemaking already started prior to the coronavirus pandemic. And so just last week, there was actually new hours of service. The final rule came out from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. It's a rule that, as an industry, we advocated for. It's largely viewed as allowing more flexibility to the driver. It's maintaining the same number of hours that they can work, but allowing them to be more flexible in how they use it, rest when they're tired, or take a break when there's traffic congestion or other some sort of adverse driving conditions. So that is something new that will kind of coincide with, as we roll out of this, those new rules being in place. And there's been some other maybe a little bit more nuanced things. Historically, states had been very territorial about their licensing procedures, and that's been done on a state-by-state basis. As different states adapted to this or handled this crisis differently, those regulations with regard to where you test and where you get CD. So I'll try to make a simple example. Let's say you live in Arkansas and you are choosing to go to work for a carrier in Indiana. So they bring you to Indiana and they put you through their school there on their campus for 3 weeks. Currently, you'd have to go back to Arkansas to test and get your CDL because that's what state where you live. Those rules were relaxed during this time so that if you were already in Indiana, they'd let you go ahead and test there and then send you back home and reciprocate your CDL. That's something that the industry's kind of advocated as making sense for quite some time, and I think you'll see some support for maybe that staying, post COVID-19. And there's some other little nuanced things that, we do things because that's the way we've always done them. And then when we're put into these extenuating circumstances, you think, oh, it really makes sense. Let's just go ahead and, make this allowance and then allow that to roll forward.
I heard an interesting perspective from a professor at a higher ed university in New York recently talk about the shift in higher education and how it's going to change because, of course, the cost to higher ed has just skyrocketed and the value is still about the same as it always has been. You haven't necessarily gotten more value out of it, but the cost has gone up. And so what he was advocating was that online education is now going to become, it's COVID-19 has created an accelerant as opposed to just an opportunity to pivot or innovation. Like we've already been trending towards these things. This just accelerates it. Mm-hmm. Is that how you feel about a lot of these things in the industry?
I do. I think that, whether we're talking about certainly the driver livability and some of the things that we had restricted and made their lives perhaps a little bit more difficult than they needed to be, their role and highlighting the work that they've done throughout this crisis has given a little bit more, a softer ear to some of those concerns. And so I do hope that we're able to utilize this and not, we're not asking for anything that would compromise. Certainly the industry is dedicated to safety and all of those things, but some things that just kind of made sense that we were hesitant to change because that's the way we'd always done it. I think certainly this, circumstance has, like you said, accelerated some things that probably would have happened eventually should we, once we'd been able to articulate the argument and collect the data. But this was kind of, you just collected the data because you had to.
Right.
And so now the data shows that the world doesn't, end if we allow this process to continue. And so, definitely there'll be some things that are accelerated through that.
So I'm curious from your perspective, along that same vein, we're in a time where there's been a lot of buzz lately about autonomous trucks, and which changes the nature of this conversation completely because you're not dealing as much with humans on the road. Where does that conversation pick up in light of all these events? And are we accelerating that side too, or does that, I don't know, where are we at with that?
Yeah, I think that the autonomous truck conversation is really attractive and sensational to people who are on the fringe of the industry. I think when you talk to people who are in it all day, every day, in an irregular route, planning, the movement of freight, that autonomous trucking is a really, really long ways away. And not necessarily because the technology doesn't exist, but because the comfortability of the people who would be required to interact with it, the infrastructure that would be needed in order to communicate with it on a continuous basis, the liability concerns that the kind of the behind the scenes framework that would need to be in place to allow that to be utilized on a large scale is a really, really massive. And I don't think that yes, can we put a truck on the road and automate it from middle America to middle America? Yes, we can do that, but not on a, you can't just turn them all loose because the infrastructure, the demand, and just people in general are not comfortable with that just yet.
So what do you see as kind of the next push into an innovative industry? Like, how do we move the industry forward, and what's kind of on the fringe that's ready to go?
I think staying in that vein, there's certainly the technology that is in support of autonomous trucking. When you say autonomous trucking, I hear driverless trucking, and those are not necessarily the same things. And so I think that there is all sorts of opportunities within improving the job of the truck driver, utilizing that technology to make that job less stressful, to maybe alleviate some of the constraints that are placed upon those types of individuals. I mean, there's all sorts of, health constraints and medicine and things of that nature that prohibit individuals from being truck drivers. But if you knew that technology was there to support them in the event that they did, have some sort of health situation, perhaps we could open up the opportunity to more individuals or loosen the restrictions on the types of medicine and types of health conditions. I certainly think there's a lot of opportunity to utilize that technology to make the trucks safer, more efficient, and more autonomous. I just don't think that you'll see 80,000 pounds going 70 miles an hour down the interstate with, more than once.
Understood. Well, and I think about, airplanes, of course, have autopilot. You can take off, land, everything without a pilot, but we don't want to put people in a plane without a pilot there. And I think it kind of falls in the same vein. Is that how you kind of associate it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, the technology is there, but the people's desire to support it is lacking.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the economic impact. Do you think we rebound quickly? Is this something that we can come out of from a industry perspective without too much of a overall loss? I mean, a lot of people are saying it'll be 2021 before you get back, and you just hopefully, like you're saying, accept the loss this year, just stay in business. Yeah,
I think certainly, the members that I talk to now are still feeling very uncertain about what this recovery looks like. I was just reading yesterday on some April numbers that have come out that show that the drop in tonnage in April was the worst in truck tonnage. So the amount of freight being hauled by our industry dropped in April greater than it had in 25 years.
Wow.
So like we're not talking about like an '08 recession. We're talking about like 1994. And so just the huge, just pulling that amount of activity out of the economy. And so the number of jobs, just the recovery from everything that I've read and some of the, industry experts that are advising, our members, they liken it to, it's not going to be flipping a switch. It's going to be a series of switches that are flipped over a long period of time. And you never know when you might flip a switch and the lights don't come on. There's certain segments of the industry, like if you look at even food processing right now, like despite their best efforts to continue to operate and continue to, stay open and process food, in the event that there's a virus outbreak, they can't. It doesn't matter how much you want to move that freight or you want to be open. There's certain things that are out of our control. And so I think if you look at the economic recovery and the solution to the health crisis are related. And as we look forward, I think I'm optimistic that that there will be a recovery throughout, that we've seen the worst of it. I think I do believe that that's true. I think that just the decisions that were made that halted the U.S. economy, I think they were made with the best intentions, but the true cost of that wasn't really known until that decision was already made. And so I don't foresee that decision will be revisited or that we'll try that approach again. And so I think that we may, because of that, the recovery may be longer and maybe prolonged to avoid some sort of health crisis that makes us feel like we need to shut down again. But we expect 2020 to be a slow recovery. Certainly the consumer demand is there. As you've seen, we've continued to see the e-commerce, you continue to see people, housing hasn't really taken a hit. Automobiles, for the ones that are available, in the market, haven't really taken that big of a hit. So if we can get Americans back to work slowly throughout the rest of the year, I think the economy, the fundamental, the economy was so good, 6 months ago. And I think if you look at, Wall Street thinks it's going to come back. They've surged this week. And so I'm optimistic that we will recover in 2020. I just think it'll be slower than we desire for it to be.
Absolutely. I think when the conversation first started around the pandemic, the hashtag was flatten the curve, right? Everybody was about flatten the curve. It was talking about the healthcare curve, slow the spread of the virus so we don't overwhelm the healthcare system. And I've talked about this a lot, but we only talked about one curve at the time. And really there's a second curve, and that was the economy and the unemployment rate, and how dramatic that curve was overnight almost. And I think since, like you were saying, we've seen the worst of it, that curve has started to flatten. But you're right, it's not just we come right back to normal. It's a slow, drawn-out recovery for the safety and well-being of everyone, but also because now we do have to do things different. We have to figure that out before we can just put everybody back to work.
Right.
So how does the ATA, how does Arkansas Trucking Association play into that? I know, obviously from my perspective, a lot of this has to do with the stories we're telling. How do we get the stories out of what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, how it's going to keep people safe, and ultimately put people back to work?
Yeah, so, I think the fact that our industry never stopped makes it a little bit more challenging thinking, how's it going to look different? Because we were kind of like doing it differently as we went. We talked about earlier, like, the lifestyle of the driver and how do they find services and how do they find food and how do they keep themselves healthy and how do they have access to masks and sanitizer. And that's all been a really complicated thing to try to figure out while they continue to move. It's not like we got to shut down and stock the trucks with hand sanitizer and stock up on masks and then send them back out. It was trying to literally passing that stuff out at a rest area while they're continuing to work. So that's been a really weird thing to try to make sure that they were healthy and keep the industry moving. If you talk about what that looks like going forward, the job of a truck driver is actually pretty safe. I mean, if you think about the scenarios in which they have been identified as high risk, I mean, they're not engaged with a large quantity of people on a frequent basis. They do spend a lot of time on their own. But then you think about the things that they're touching or perhaps the scenarios in which they're going into, and those scenarios could potentially be high risk. If you're delivering to a hospital in New Orleans, then all of a sudden your low risk job just became, a high risk exposure. And so we've been working on trying to make sure that drivers have access to testing. I think that's something that we've been working on extremely recently, just announced that yesterday. And we were able to make the argument that, the position itself is not necessarily high risk, but you don't know where they're delivering to, you don't know where they're going. They're continuing to move throughout the country and then return home to their families and their communities. And how can we help them do that and feel safe and feel valued and feel like they're doing that with the best information available? And we think that is by allowing them, if they so choose, to have be tested for COVID-19. And so just yesterday, the Department of Health made being a commercial truck driver kind of like a qualifying condition. So if a truck driver wants to be tested, they can go to their community health clinic and get tested. So that's something to help the drivers feel better about themselves and be conscientious about their own health, but then also the communities that they're returning to. You don't want, the last thing that we want is for some community to have some negative perception of, this truck driver went somewhere and brought, COVID-19 back to our community. So we're doing everything that we can to try to make the drivers feel safe, but then also have the information and access to protect themselves.
Well, that's perfect, because I think, the reality is the whole travel industry shut down because that's what we're trying to do, is avoid people having to go from one place to the other. But it's the very nature of the job of a truck driver to go from one community to another. And like you said, put themselves in sometimes fairly high risk areas. So that's great that you guys were able to help kind of push that along and allow the drivers to feel more at ease. And I think you're right, the communities as a whole feel more at ease that they can have access to testing in the right gear. When we walked in here today, saw boxes of masks and sanitizer that you guys are passing out. So I think that's all perfect.
Yeah.
I mean,
and all in kind of evolution of what our organization does and why. There's certainly, promote, protect, and serve is a very broad umbrella for which that we, say that we do as an organization, but that has certainly taken on some new meanings and new tasks over the last 3 months.
Yeah, well, I want to shift gears a little bit because one of the big conversations coming out of this whole thing as well is, how are leaders leading through all of this? And so from a personal level, when all this first happened, everybody sort of figured out, are we going to work from home? Do we have to go to the office? Whatever that looks like for each organization has been different based on your needs. But as someone leading not only your own organization, but really kind of being a voice of an industry, what have you done to sort of, kind of keep yourself sane? Let's be honest. Everybody has to kind of figure out how to do that. Do I wake up every morning and get dressed like I always did, or do I do my Zoom calls in, what I slept in last night? I think that's been a fun, interesting thing we've been seeing. But what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so it is an interesting mix of, our association is not a trucking company, but we represent an industry that didn't get to take a break. And so that was a very delicate balance in, what's safe and what makes sense for the actual type of work that our organization does. And then how do we reflect, and be sensitive to the strains that our members are experiencing. And so we kind of split the baby on that. We had some members of the team elect to work from home. I our office is plenty spacious, and I have 2 kids, 2 dogs, and 2 cats, and so working from home is not really that feasible for me. And so I continued to come into the office just because I felt like that's how I identified or connected to the business owners that we were trying to serve. And it did feel like, it really felt like a crisis. It did really feel like we were having not Zoom calls, but conference calls on a regular basis to try to share as much information as possible. I felt like really, in an uncertain time or in times where you feel like you don't know, what to do, that the camaraderie of knowing that everyone else felt the same way, there was value in that. And so we did have calls for our trucking executives to just kind of have that community of, this is what I'm experiencing, or this is what I'm, in this part of the country, I've had this particular trouble. And so as an organization, we were doing everything that we could to advocate for, the most consistent operational, groundwork, but then also just kind of being a facilitator and a counselor of, come together, tell us what your challenges are, because that's the only way that I'm going to know how to help you, is if I know what's, bothering you today.
Sure. Well, I think communication has been the key through all of this. If people aren't communicating, if there's not clear lines, then everybody's guessing. And to your point, nobody feels like anybody else understands what they're going through.
Right.
This is just me. I'm dealing with it. Have you noticed that you've kind of taken on different personal daily habits or things, or has it been pretty much business as usual from your perspective?
I thrive in routine, and so for me, it has been as normal as possible. Continuing to get up every morning, get dressed, and come to the office and turn the computer on, and find out what the crisis of the day was. For a while, that's kind of what it felt like. And so, my routine didn't change that much. Certainly it's different. It feels different. There's no, you park in an empty parking deck and you ride the elevator alone, and, there's no one here to answer the phone. And so it feels different. It did feel as though we were experiencing something that was unusual. But having that consistency for me it made me feel like there was something normal about navigating what was certainly not normal.
Yeah. As I've talked to a lot of people as well, I think one of the interesting parallels is, every organization wants to have a strong team. You want to bring in strong team members to get you through. But then when you're faced with unique situations like this, the importance of that team becomes more and more paramount. So talk me through kind of your direction. How do you create a solid team, and then how do they function and push forward on that vision and mission that you guys have created?
Yeah, so I do think we do have a great team. There's 7 of us that work full time at the association, and we each, everybody's different. We have a small office environment. Everyone has their own roles and responsibilities, and it certainly works better when we're all here. It feels better when we're all here and we all are communicating regularly, and who's pulling various ways. But in this particular case, like as you mentioned, communication, regulation, and being able to tell the story of the industry and what was happening were all really, really important. And my communications director is fantastic. And so she and I we talked, every day. She's actually one of the ones that she has a health condition that made sense for her to work from home. But it really just kind of forced us to be more communicative. I am an introvert. It's easy for me. I'd rather just do it myself, and I'd rather make a list and knock it out. But that wasn't feasible during this time. We had to divide and conquer, and we had to communicate, and I had to, delegate and rely on other people to be able to have the answers that I couldn't give. And so it's been, I would say that probably most good teams would say this has been a good experience for them. No one would choose to or sign up to navigate through a health crisis and an economic crisis, but it has allowed us to know what we're good at and who to kind of rely on in those different situations. And I think that we'll be better going forward because of this, time of crisis that we lived through together.
Is there anything about the industry as a whole that you feel like is often overlooked, other than the industry as a whole? What do people need to know, like, as they enter back into traveling more and things like that? I mean, what's something important for people to keep in mind?
I think, what I hope comes from this, and what I hope that we're able to leverage and help people understand better, is the type of men and women that are truck drivers. I think that is very often just kind of ill-conceived, whether it's, someone that you saw at a truck stop or a movie that you watched or whatever. Like, people's perception of that is something that is distant or that they don't associate with, not necessarily the individual that they go to church with or that lives 3 streets over that they don't realize is a truck driver. And so I hope that the true, humanity, the hard work and dedication, the pride that those individuals have in, truck driving is a hard job in 2019.
Right.
It's something that the people that do it largely choose to do it because they feel pride. They know that what they're doing is essential. They know that whether you acknowledge it or not, that without them, there wouldn't have been, groceries in the grocery store. And so I hope that the service that they provide and the pride that they take in their job is somehow resonates, and that people are able to hold on to that beyond coronavirus.
I think one of the things that's going to continue to evolve out of this whole pandemic is, we all as humans, we relate to stories. We want to create stories in our head, and we want people to tell us good stories. And one of the things that I think is absolutely going to happen is, just like any good story, you're going to have heroes and you're going to have villains. And I think coming out of this, we're going to automatically view healthcare workers as heroes, as they are. Frontline workers that have put themselves, in harm's way and gone to work every day and done the hard job to, eradicate this virus the best they can and heal people that have gotten it. But there's going to be unsung heroes as well. And I think truck drivers have to be part of that conversation, because to the conversation we just had, without them, we would all be sitting at home hunting squirrels in our backyard.
Yeah. I would say that, I've been surprised, but pleasantly surprised. If you look at some of the stories that major, retailers and marketers have told, like if you look at, the media commercials that are running now about, everybody's jumping on recognize the true heroes or, everyday heroes and those types of platforms and programs, that if you just capture any of them, it is, healthcare workers, truck drivers, or they call, in some markets they call it delivery drivers, or, but the profile and awareness is certainly greater than it was before. And so I do think that there is an opportunity for the truck drivers to be seen in a more heroic light, and for their efforts to continue to work in, times where, they themselves have had to be a little bit afraid, and continuing to work throughout that I do think people will appreciate that role more and the work that they do.
Well, I think it was earlier this month, the Blue Angels were doing and the Thunderbirds were doing flyovers over a lot of communities to thank the frontline workers. And I would love to lobby to get them to fly down I-40 and just,
that's a good idea.
Thank a truck driver.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that.
So if you're out there, if you're listening, thank any truck driver that you know.
I appreciate that.
Definitely allowing us to live as normal of a life as we can during this crazy time. Okay. What's next for you guys? What's on your big goals list coming out of this? I mean, what do you guys want to do moving forward?
So I have two. goals for, when you quote unquote big goals for this year. And one of them it comes from coronavirus, and that is to make sure that we don't miss the opportunity to tell the story of what trucking has done during the crisis, and leverage the exposure and the opportunity to just kind of make known what they've done and take advantage of that. And then the second one was our goal. The big thing that we were supposed to be working on this year was the November election for the half-cent highway campaign, which is the culmination of years worth of efforts to try to secure, long-term adequate funding for the infrastructure of this state. And so if you think about, all of our appreciation for truck drivers, and then, the safety, reliability, all of the network that they rely on to do their job is at risk, and the funding for that is at risk. And so what we had planned on focusing this year on was communicating to the public, the importance of infrastructure, and whether it be your school bus or how you get to work and back, having adequate funding for that. And that was supposed to be our big project. And I think now the message shifts, because now we're looking at an economic recovery and the opportunity to continue to fund construction jobs, maintenance jobs, city and county governments. I mean, all of those things that were sort of underlying issues before, now perhaps there's a shift in, yes, we need adequate and safe roads, but now it's not the time to pull that money out of the economy if you start looking at, construction and maintenance projects and city and county governments.
I think it's easy to put a lot of attention on the truck drivers and the things they've had to continue to do, because they're kind of the visible ones in the industry. But there's a lot of people behind the scenes that goes into trucking companies and making sure, from a leadership perspective and operational perspective, keeping trucks on the road, this decision making from CEOs and chief operating officers at larger trucking companies. What have you seen talking to those people, those leaders of organizations? Because it's hard on them too. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times we want to say, well, the truck driver is the one going from point A to point B and having to figure out how to stay safe during that time. But it's difficult for a leader to make the decision. Do we do that? Because we got to get these goods there. We have to make the tough decisions. How has that conversation been, talking to these people?
Yeah, so I think that they have very much shouldered kind of the responsibility that we've talked about, like, how do we continue to do what we know we have to do while demonstrating confidence and making sure that our employees are safe? How do we protect the office? To your point, I mean, over 80,000 people in Arkansas work in the trucking industry. More than half of them are in support roles than they are actually driving a truck. And so you think about, yes, the truck driver has to continue to move, but someone is in the office talking to the shipper and talking to the receiver and making sure that all the paperwork and documentation and safety procedures and maintenance of the equipment. I mean, there's so many things that are going into making sure that freight is delivered. That yes, all of those people, they were also essential, and they were also continuing to go to work for the most part, particularly in the small. If you look at companies that were running 100 trucks. In that, the mid-size carriers, those companies are not set up to send everybody home. Right. And so you have, small communities across the state where you had, 50 and 60 people showing up for work every day in an environment in which their leaders and their CEOs were trying to lead by example and be present. But they're also unsure, how am I going to pay these drivers? How am I going to make sure that they have enough miles? How am I going to go find freight so that they're not sitting, the worst thing to happen was to have a driver who's deemed essential and working, but away from home and not making any money. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's just been a lot of pressure on a lot of people to make sure that the job that needs to be done gets done. But then also, as that became more challenging and as the economy began to shrink, how do we keep our people employed? How do we keep them moving? How do we make enough money so that they're not having to furlough employees and do the things that some other industries, were forced to do. So, it's been a lot of pressure on the industry as a whole. So whether you were managing that driver and trying to make him feel more comfortable on the road, or managing an entire operation and trying to, make sure that your employees were safe and that they had protective equipment, or that they were able to space out. I know we had a member who was talking about, what normally would have been the conference room, or what normally would have been, unutilized white box space, over some other, department. They're moving desks or moving computers to try to accommodate, social distancing and keep people from sitting right on top of each other. So it's definitely been just a super weird time to navigate, but really proud of the people who have done what needed to be done to keep the industry moving.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the important messages coming out of all this, especially in the trucking industry, logistics, supply chain, because it's more sort of behind the scenes, it's not quite as visible. And what is visible is the drivers themselves. So I think people need to have gratitude for people like truck drivers and healthcare workers. They need to have empathy and compassion for the leaders of these organizations that have had to make tough decisions and probably didn't make the right decision every time, but had to make a decision. Mm-hmm. And they bear the weight of that, and they have to live with whatever that decision was. And so I just hope as things kind of continue to get back to normal, there's just a sense of gratitude for the people that were out there doing the jobs visibly, and then compassion and empathy for the ones that had to make those tough decisions.
Yeah, no, I certainly would share your hope that people would understand that the industry is certainly, that the job the truck drivers have done is visible and appreciated, but they can't do that alone, and there was a lot of support behind them from individuals and executives trying to make sure that the driver's life was as livable and easy. Easy is not the right word. Just trying to make sure that their job was doable. But then there were people who were stressed out, sitting behind a desk somewhere as well.
Yeah. So one of the other things about your role is kind of the lobbying, political side, talking to politicians. Do you like that? Is that something that you enjoy about the job? Is that something that you work hard at?
Right. So when I came to the association, that was certainly not something that I had a pedigree in, or any experience, or really even a natural interest in. But if you fast forward to today, certainly, our organization is charged with preventing bad ideas from becoming bad laws. I mean, like, if you think about the way that policymakers make their decisions, if they don't have adequate information, then they make inadequate decisions. And so I have really enjoyed working on that the last 2 or 3 years. I think prior to, I became president in 2014, and prior to that, there really wasn't an opportunity for me to be involved. And so when I kind of was like thrust into it, I really didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have any experience. We had a lot of people on contract trying to kind of help bridge the gap between the relationships that didn't exist. And I, while being an introvert, and if you're kind of thrust into what would be lobbying and political relations, so much of that is relationship based. But for me, I'm so competitive. And so, like, the trigger that makes me work harder, that makes me try to message it different, that makes me want to, engage with people who think differently than I do, is how can we win? How can we make them see this issue or this problem through our point of view, and how can we convince them that our approach or that our resolution is the right one for this particular challenge? So I have been surprised with really the people. I mean, the people that I've been able to make relationships with, and been able to leverage those relationships in order to get positive policy changes for the industry, has been really rewarding in a way that I didn't anticipate.
Another interesting thing that I find specifically with Arkansas Trucking Association is, I think proof that the world is advancing and moving in directions that probably when deregulation happened, people would have never seen this coming. But your organization is predominantly, if not all, women and run by women. So talk to me about what that's like, being in an industry that has historically and probably still been dominated by men.
Yeah, so our board of directors has 21 people on it, and I believe that 3 of them are female. So, and that might capture all of the female executives throughout the membership. So the industry itself is very male dominated, and most of them, started their business or entered the industry in the 80s and have continued to manage their companies or work in the industry since then. I certainly perceived it to be a disadvantage early in my career because I just felt like an outsider. And there are still circumstances in which that is true. I don't get invited to the golf outing or the hunting trip or the floating whatever. There are circumstances in which it is still somewhat of a challenge or something to overcome. But I just think that people recognize hard work, and I'm not willing to accept being left out, perhaps. And so I think I actually had this conversation with a colleague who's a male who is approximately my age, who represents another industry, and he was like, "Well, how did you get involved? How did you get involved in this task force that was working on this particular problem?" And I was like, "You have to be aggressive. Like, if you want to be included, you're going to have to lean in, demonstrate your value, and ask to be included." And so, while I may be an introvert, I've never been accused of not being forward or sharp in asking for something that I wanted. And so, I think that's been this weird dynamic of, no, it doesn't look like what you thought it would look like, but the attributes and the characteristics that represent the industry, which would be hard work and commitment and dedication. Some of those elements remain true even if I'm not an old white man. Within the organization, the team's built out to the strengths that we need, and it just happened. The three of us have been here since before I was in leadership, and so I can't take credit for them, but if you think about public relations and communications and events and some of the stuff that an organization like ours is charged with, those are predominantly female roles, and so it's not that unusual to have an organization that's primarily female, but to have an all-female office representing a predominantly male industry is certainly unusual.
Yeah. And I hope as we continue to move forward, one of the things I do with my organization is exactly that, not look at gender for any reason. What I look at is perspective. Do you bring a different perspective to the table, whether your, gender, race, or age matters. Mm-hmm. But really, to me, it makes no difference. If you're man, woman, white, black, right, young, old, if you fit the job and if you can get it done, then let's leave that conversation off the table.
I definitely agree with you. I think that what I would look at is, what are the skill set, and what do you bring to the table that, meets the needs that we have. But also, and I know you're in the same, this is a small office. And so, what type of personality dynamic are you introducing into? I think something that's really special about our organization is that it's pleasurable. Like, it's enjoyable to come to work, and we enjoy each other's company, and we visit, and everything is, amicable. And when you talk about bringing someone else into a team that's at that size, yes, you want a different perspective. You don't want everyone to be the same, but you also are looking for a personality and a kind of a culture fit that will allow everyone to continue to work together in a positive way.
You can't get to the position you're in alone. There has to be some people that have led the way for you, or people that you look at, what I like to call titans in your own world, people that sort of have helped get you here. So who stands out? Who are some of those people along the way?
Oh, that's two different questions. People that helped me get here, or people that I would perceive to be titans in the industry, or people that I would look up to. Maybe two different classifications. You're right. No one gets to a position of leadership without someone helping them. And I think it's hard for me to name one person, but collectively, I've been at the association 18 years. And so I think as a very young and green individual who came just looking for an opportunity and committed to, working hard, there were people who noticed that and encouraged it and fostered it, and didn't necessarily pat me on the head and tell me to, go back to my office. And so there were, members of the board when I first started were people like Robert Young and Sheridan Garrison and JB Hunt. I mean, those people were still involved when I started. And so to have access to those individuals and to be encouraged to speak up and to participate certainly gave me confidence. I don't know at that time whether I deserved it or not, but I think all of those individuals lending credibility to our organization and giving me a voice helped me see that there was a future for me here. And I don't know that I would have, I certainly didn't see it in myself. Like when I came here, I didn't think one day I'm going to be the president of this organization. That was an idea that was planted in me from the people who were in leadership here, who saw that was an opportunity for me.
I love that. Okay, we'll move into just some real quick hit questions because
Sure.
I love these. But are you a reader?
I'm not. I know you're
No?
going to ask that. I am not an avid reader. I mean, I read like the news,
Sure.
but I don't read books for fun.
Are you a TV watcher?
Kinda.
Tiger King? Did you get
I
into
did Tiger
it?
King. Outer Banks was my most recent binge series.
That's fair enough. I like that. Daily routine. What do you have to do every single day? I know a lot of people it's coffee right out of bed. Some people it's coffee in the office.
Yeah.
Do you exercise, work out?
I do work out, but if I told you I worked out every single day, that'd be a lie. I try to work out 4 days a week. My probably unfortunate thing that I'll share, like I like to play games on my phone before I go to bed.
Okay, you
like,
got to tell us what games.
Veg out. My game right now is called Two Dots. So like it's sort of like if you think about like if you go Tetris or any sort of like mind logic, something. My mind goes 1,000 miles an hour about everything that I should be doing while I'm not doing it. And so in order for me to just completely turn it off before I go to sleep, I have to unplug and make my mind think about Two Dots instead of the unanswered emails.
Fair enough. I completely I get that. Best piece of advice you either given or received?
Know what you're good at, and more importantly, know what you're not.
So are you a don't do what you're not good at or double down on your weaknesses?
I am at accentuate the positive and backfill on the negative.
Gotcha. Do you have any relatively new habits that you formed, whether they're good or bad?
No.
Good. Well, you mentioned you're a person of routine. You like the routine,
Right.
so that probably keeps you from forming new habits very easily,
Yeah.
but conversely, forming bad habits.
Yeah, I I don't really like surprises or variants, and so if it's new, I'm not a real big fan.
If you could write a book, what would the title be?
My grandmother would say there's no such thing as good enough.
I like that. That's good. Hey, and grandmothers know best.
That's right.
All right, music. What are you jamming out to in the car on your way to the office?
So I'm a top 40 kind of, generic whatever is new. I love music. I can't, in fact, this is probably not good for I can't stand not to listen to music in the car. So I thrive on my music. In fact, when I travel, the thing that I miss the most is the time in the car with my music. So whatever is new on top 40, I'm a big Taylor Swift fan, a huge Justin Timberlake fan. anyone who knows me would bust my chops if I didn't mention that. So if I had to claim my favorites, those are them.
All right, and favorite foods. What do you do when you pick a restaurant or you cook at home? What's your go-to?
So we eat Larry's Pizza every Friday night, and we have for 11 years. So I'm hardcore committed to Larry's Pizza in Bryant, which is where we live. And then probably like as though Larry's Pizza is not bad enough, my kind of guilty pleasure is macaroni and cheese. Like if you told me that.
Kraft out of a box?
No.
Okay.
Real macaroni and
stuff.
cheese. Yeah. Homemade macaroni and cheese.
Fair enough. All right. What can people do to find out more about your association or the trucking industry at large if they want to be supportive?
Sure. So the Arkansas Trucking Association is on every social media platform that you might be able to find. Our website is arkansastrucking.com, and you can go there to learn about what we do as an organization, how we serve our members, and how we advocate for the drivers as well.
Awesome. Well, Shannon, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
If you liked this episode of Titans of Industry, head to contenttitan.co/podcast for more episodes or subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. Thanks for listening.